Communication, understood as the process of sending and receiving messages, is particularly important in professional settings. Effective communication at the workplace can lead to quicker problem solving, stronger decision making, increased productivity, and steadier workflow. That, in turn, can have an impact on a company's outcomes in terms of stronger business relationships, clearer promotional materials, enhanced professional image, and improved stakeholder response. How can you learn to communicate more effectively in your daily life, particularly in professional settings? Practice is the obvious answer to that. You certainly need to practice a lot, no doubt about that. But one more thing you can do is to familiarize yourself with basic theories and concepts that can help you explain the communication process. These can become useful tools for you to analyze yourself as a communicator as well as others. Let us start our discussion by highlighting what goes on during the act of communication. What are the main phases in every communication process? First of all, the sender of the message has an idea. That idea is usually associated with a purpose. You would like to communicate with others to achieve a purpose or purposes. Your purpose can be to inform, to persuade, to request, to instruct, or simply to maintain social bonds. Next, the sender encodes the idea. Based on the purpose and the context in which communication is taking place, the sender turns that idea in his or her brain into a message, choosing appropriate language. In doing so, the sender opts for a channel and a medium to transmit the message. Depending on the channel chosen, the message would become verbal, nonverbal, meaning a message that is communicated through facial expressions and other forms of body language, or a combination of these two. Verbal messages can be encoded in the spoken or the written form. The sender also needs to choose the most appropriate medium of transmission for the message to be communicated most effectively. Thus, the message can be communicated by means of face-to-face interaction, through the telephone, in a letter or an email, a WhatsApp, and so on. Next, the message reaches the receiver through the medium chosen by the sender. Relying on the context, the receiver decodes the message. That is to say, the receiver interprets what the message is all about, making use of shared context. Finally, the receiver may or may not send feedback to the sender. You have heard the word context a few times by now, because context is a key aspect in any act of communication. However, the notion of context remains largely under-theorized in communication studies and also in linguistic theories. Two key figures who have contributed to theorizing context are Bronislaw Malinowski and Michael Halliday. Malinowski was a social anthropologist responsible for establishing the School of Functionalism in the field. When conducting his fieldwork in Papua New Guinea, Malinowski advanced the technique of participant observation, which remains the hallmark of ethnographic research nowadays. While he was living with the people whose culture he was studying, Malinowski realized that even though he could understand the words that they were saying, sometimes he could not make 100% sense of what these words actually meant, because the context in which the communication was taking place was not rich enough. Michael Halliday, on the other hand, is widely recognized as one of the most influential figures in 20th century linguistics. He developed a brand of linguistics known as systemic functional linguistics. Making use of Malinowski's insights, Halliday tried to integrate the notion of context into his linguistic theories. So, what do Halliday and Malinowski have to say about context? The key premise is that we do not communicate in isolation. What we communicate always takes place in situated context. First, context is situated within the material world. For instance, a textbook, a lecture, a casual conversation in a cafe, a jury trial, etc. Depending on such context, what people say may mean one thing or another. Secondly, context is also situated in history or time. what happened before and after the moment of communicating the message. Thirdly, context is situated within social relationships. That is, who we are communicating with. Friends, strangers, your boss, etc. That is why you do not communicate in the same way when you talk to your best friend and when you talk to strangers. Last but not least, context is situated in connection with other texts. That happens because texts never occur in isolation. They are connected with previous as well as with future texts. In studying the role of context in communication, Malinowski differentiated between two types of context: context of situation and context of culture. The context of situation focuses on the micro, the specific environment in which one single act of communication is taking place at a particular moment in space and time. In contrast with that, the context of culture focuses on the macro, the totality of things that typically occur in a culture, from which multiple contexts of situation originates. What do we mean by that? Let me try to explain it with one example. Do you know what's going on in this picture? Would you know how to behave if you were involved in this event? If you come from Hong Kong, you would easily recognize what's going on in this picture, as this experience is part of your collective memory as a member of a culture. So, if you once have the opportunity to participate in this event, you will probably be able to do so naturally, without making mistakes. But when we are involved with other cultures, we experience situations which are unfamiliar to us, and we may not know how to behave, what to say, and what to do. For instance, do you know what this picture is all about? This is the problem Malinowski encountered when he was doing his fieldwork among the Pacific Islander groups. He was able to understand the words when he was talking to people, but he still had problems grasping what was going on because his knowledge of the culture was limited. The picture, by the way, shows sugar skulls and pan de muertos, used to decorate the altars in Mexican houses during a festival called Dia de Muertos, or Day of the Dead. To cut this short, Dia de Muertos is the Mexican equivalent to the Chinese Qingming festival. These food items in the picture are also consumed during the festival, where the Mexicans remember their ancestors. As we grow up, not only we learn how to do things with words in context, we also store those experiences in our memory, which can be subsequently used in future communications. Then, when we encounter contexts of situation familiar to us, we are able to immediately retrieve that knowledge stored in our memory, and we can figure out what to do and what to say. For instance, we are able to figure out which language may be appropriate in a specific context of situation and which language is not appropriate. Let's use the coffee shop scene in the picture as an example of context of situation. Which of these three options would you choose if you were the lady in the picture talking to the waiter? Would you choose to say, "Excuse me, may I have a refill?" Would you rather say, "May I have a refill, please?" I guess you may find option 3 quite odd, don't you? Imagine for a second these were the words being uttered in a coffee shop. Every time something odd occurs in real-life communication, we would try to make sense of things by trying to figure out in which context of situation such words would be chosen. Now the answer key. I would say, "May I have a refill, please?" is the most appropriate choice here. Option 1 is less preferred because the man is already looking at the lady. So the expression "excuse me," used to attract someone's attention at the beginning of an utterance, is not needed. Option 3 is definitely highly unusual. It is flirtatious and definitely politically incorrect in the 21st century context of culture, unless it is meant as a joke among close friends. If the lady in the picture and the man happen to know each other very well, and the context of situation is that of a joke, those words would suddenly become a valid option. Based on these insights, Michael Halliday came up with 3 concepts to better analyze context, where the notion of context includes both the context of situation and the context of culture discussed by Malinowski. As I have stressed before, the context of situation is the micro view, the instance, and the context of culture is the macro perspective, what Halliday also calls the system. That macro perspective, the way things are, is part of our world knowledge as an individual and as a member of a culture. Halliday often explains the difference between the micro and the macro using the example of weather versus climate. Both weather and climate are part of the same phenomenon being looked at from 2 different perspectives, the micro and the macro. These 3 concepts suggested by Halliday to further explain context are field, tenor, and mode. Like in the case of context of situation and context of culture, field, tenor, and mode cannot be really separated from each other during communication. They are also part of the same reality being looked at from different perspectives. Let us start with the field. This has to do with what is going on during communication, with the nature of social interaction, as illustrated by the things people are saying or writing. In other words, the field has to do with the kind of reality being constructed during communication. In the example studied before, the field would have to do with ordering a refill during a service encounter. But alternatively, the field could have been about flirting with a handsome guy or joking with a close friend. The focus in the tenor is on the participants, who they are in terms of their social identities, their roles and status, and how they relate to each other during communication. For instance, are the people friends or strangers? Can they be considered equal, or are there power differences among them? How does the tenor affect the use of language in the example we saw before? Depending on who you are talking to, you may choose to start by saying, "Hello, how are you today?" and then order a cup of tea. If the barista knows you, he may call you Andy or mate if you happen to be in Australia, instead of addressing you as sir or madam. No one would call you sir or madam unless you are old enough. I still remember the first time I was addressed as sir when I ordered a cup of coffee. It was then when I suddenly realized I was getting old. Last but not least, the focus in the mode is on the code, on the text itself, on how language works during communication. When discussing the mode, you may ask yourselves a number of questions. The first question you may want to ask has to do with the purpose of communication and with how such purpose is reflected in the way the text is organized. You also need to ask yourselves about the channel and medium chosen for communication and how these choices may affect communication. For instance, in the service encounter we have been discussing, the communication channel chosen is face-to-face spoken communication, combining verbal and non-verbal language, that is, words and gestures. Option 2, "May I have a refill, please?" becomes the preferred alternative because of the combination of verbal and non-verbal language typical of face-to-face communication. As we explained before, "excuse me" in option 1 is redundant here because the barista is already looking at the lady and she does not need to attract his attention. In conclusion, effective communication first of all requires a meeting of minds between participants in terms of shared contexts and worldviews. The more specialized or the more culturally alien the context of communication is, the more challenging it would be to choose the right words to communicate things and to engage with others appropriately. When such meeting of minds cannot take place, and when one makes the wrong choices, when one chooses the wrong medium and channel of transmission, when one chooses the wrong words and so on, the result is noise. Too much noise can sometimes hinder communication or can even render it impossible. In this last slide, you can see how Halliday explains the connection between individual texts and the context, both the context of situation and the context of culture. He also explains how the feel, tenor, and mode in the context of situation can be eventually realized as text, making use of three types of resources available in the language system. These three types of resources, the ideational, interpersonal, and the textual resources related to the feel, the tenor, and the mode, will be the main topic discussed in Lecture 2.